In 1999, Radio Shack wasn't just a store, it was a fixture of American life. 8,000 locations, $5 billion a year in sales. And this is the number that's almost hard to believe. 94% of the entire United States population lived within a 5-minute drive of one. Think about that for a second. Not a Walmart, not a McDonald's, a Radio Shack. 9 out of every 10 Americans could get in their car, drive 5 minutes, and be standing in front of a wall of batteries, wires, and electronics parts. 15 years later, the company was filing for bankruptcy. Not once, twice. The stores closed. The name got passed around like a piece of unwanted furniture, sold from owner to owner, until it eventually ended up attached to a cryptocurrency token during the speculative mania of the early 2020s. A company that once anchored strip malls in nearly every town in America was reduced to a punchline on a crypto exchange. So how does a business go from that kind of dominance to that kind of collapse in a decade and a half? That's the story we're breaking down today, the full arc of Radio Shack, from a struggling radio parts shop to a $5 billion retail giant, and then the slow, then sudden, unraveling that took it apart. The Radio Shack story doesn't start with a triumphant launch. It starts with a small, unremarkable chain of stores in the Boston area that sold radio components to hobbyists, the kind of people who built their own ham radios and tinkered with electronics as a pastime. By the early 1960s, this little chain had already been around for 4 decades, and it was struggling. It wasn't going anywhere. That changed in 1962, when an entrepreneur named Charles Tandy bought the company. Tandy didn't just want to keep the lights on. He wanted to turn this niche little chain into a real business, and he did it by making a decision that sounds almost backwards for a company trying to grow. He shrank it. Before Tandy took over, Radio Shack's shelves were cluttered with something like 40,000 different products. Tandy's first move was to slash that down to roughly 2,500 items. Instead of trying to be everything to everyone, he sharpened the focus onto a specific kind of customer, people who needed to buy, and often repair, their own electronics. That focus mattered because of the era. In the 1960s and 70s, electronics weren't the disposable, sealed-shut gadgets we think of today. A radio, a television, an amplifier, these were big, bulky, and modular. If a component burned out, you didn't throw the whole thing away. You went down to a store like Radio Shack, bought the replacement part, and fixed it yourself. And the customers of that era were primed for exactly that kind of behavior. Many of the adults shopping in Radio Shack stores in the 60s and 70s had grown up during the Great Depression. That generation tended to be frugal and deeply conservative about spending. When they bought something, they wanted it to last. And if it broke, their instinct was to repair it, not replace it. Radio Shack was built, almost perfectly, to serve that mindset. Tandy's timing lined up with a much bigger shift happening across the country. Really Regency. In the post-war years, the US had a booming, rising middle class. American manufacturing was humming, wages were climbing, and that wealth was trickling down to more and more households. People were buying cars, and as car ownership exploded, so did strip malls and shopping centers built around easy driving access. That infrastructure was tailor-made for Radio Shack's business model. Need a part for your radio or your television? Hop in the car, drive down to the strip mall, walk into a Radio Shack, and grab what you needed. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the company rode this wave hard, expanding into a go-to destination for almost any piece of home electronics. Landline phones, VCRs, answering machines, radios, TV antennas, and of course, batteries for all of it. Radio Shack also had a habit of getting to new technology early, which built real credibility with customers. In 1977, Years before most people had ever touched a personal computer, Radio Shack introduced the TRS-80, nicknamed, half affectionately and half mockingly, the Trash 80. It was a floppy disk-driven home computer that went head-to-head with the earliest Apple machines, and it hit the market before most of its competitors even had a product to sell. By the late 1990s, all of this had compounded into a retail juggernaut, $5 billion in annual sales. 8,000 stores. That's staggering 94% coverage of the US population within a 5-minute drive. Radio Shack had become one of the most ubiquitous brands in American retail, a company that had successfully ridden not just one wave of consumer electronics, but several in a row. Success like that can feel permanent from the inside. It almost never is. Around this same period, the tail end of the 20th century, some of the very people who had built Radio Shack into a juggernaut were starting to age out of the business. Charles Tandy and the generation of managers who had shaped the company's identity and strategy were leaving, retiring, or simply losing influence. That kind of institutional knowledge doesn't transfer automatically, and the timing could not have been worse because the ground underneath the entire electronics industry was about to shift. For decades, Radio Shack's whole reason for existing was built on the idea that electronics were modular and repairable, that when something broke, you fixed it rather than replaced it. But by the late 1980s and into the 1990s, that premise was eroding fast. Manufacturing had gotten cheaper and more efficient, and companies increasingly designed electronics to be inexpensive and disposable rather than serviceable. If your stereo amplifier broke in the 1970s, repairing the core components might cost you close to $1,000. By the 1990s, you could just buy a brand new amp for around $200. There was almost no financial argument left for repair. Generational habits shifted right alongside the products. Gen X and later millennials came of age with a completely different relationship to their belongings than their parents or grandparents. The old fix it and keep it running mentality gave way to something else entirely, an attitude that valued having the newest, most current version of a product more than understanding how to maintain an old one. Throwing something away and replacing it wasn't even a moment of hesitation the way it might have been for a previous generation. Radio Shack's entire foundation, the DIY repair customer, was quietly disappearing. At the same time, a different kind of competition was emerging, and it didn't even require the internet yet. Long before e-commerce as we know it, catalog and mail-order retail was already chipping away at Radio Shack's advantage. In the 1980s, if you wanted a computer, you no longer had to walk into a Radio Shack. You could order one directly from a company like Dell, HP, or Compaq through a catalog or an early online order form. When you're spending several $1,000s on a computer, that kind of purchase becomes standardized enough that convenience and price start to matter more than a local storefront. Why pay a premium to buy in person when you could order remotely and save real money? As this remote buying behavior grew, Radio Shack's greatest historical strength, its dense footprint of stores in strip malls across the country, started to look more like a liability. All those leases, all that overhead, all those physical locations were expensive to maintain, and they no longer translated into an automatic advantage now that customers had other ways to buy. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it's a pattern that shows up again and again in business history. The exact same asset that made Radio Shack unstoppable, thousands of small, tightly packed stores blanketing the country, was, at its core, a fixed cost. When that density gave Radio Shack an edge nobody else could match, it was a competitive moat. The moment customers stopped needing to physically walk into a store to get what they wanted, that same moat turned into an anchor. The company wasn't just losing sales at that point, it was still paying rent, still paying staff, still paying utilities on thousands of locations that were becoming less and less necessary by the year. A strength and a liability were sitting inside the exact same real estate footprint, and which one it was depended entirely on how customers wanted to shop. Unfortunately for RadioShack, that answer was starting to change underneath their feet, and it would keep changing for the next 2 decades. If shifting consumer habits and early e-commerce were the first cracks in the foundation, the rise of big box retail was the next major blow. In the 1990s, Walmart and Target began an aggressive push to expand their physical footprint, not just opening more stores, but making each individual store significantly larger. That extra square footage gave them room to build out deep, expansive electronic sections in the back of their stores. And this was happening right as a flood of cheap manufactured goods was arriving from China and other overseas markets, including dirt-cheap LCD televisions. Walmart and Target used those televisions as loss leaders, selling them at cost, or even below cost, during Black Friday and other big promotional events, purely to get shoppers in the door to buy everything else in the store. For Walmart and Target, it was a brilliant strategy. For RadioShack, competing directly against that kind of pricing, it was devastating. There was simply no way to profitably match those numbers. Then came Best Buy. By 2005, Best Buy had become an absolute juggernaut in electronics retail, with around 800 stores nationwide. But the real problem for RadioShack wasn't the store count, it was the size difference. The average Best Buy location ran over 20,000 square feet. RadioShack's small format stores, tucked into strip malls, averaged around 2,500 square feet, less than an eighth of the space. There was no physical way for RadioShack to stock the same breadth of products or offer anything close to the same shopping experience as a Best Buy superstore. RadioShack's entire growth strategy for decades had been built around saturation, being extremely convenient, with a store within a 5-minute drive of nearly everyone. That strategy meant a huge share of their locations were in strip centers and shopping malls, and nearly a third of their footprint specifically sat inside malls. That would become its own separate problem as American malls began their long decline. As e-commerce accelerated and big box retailers kept expanding, mall traffic started shrinking, and RadioShack's mall-based stores went down with them. The kind of spontaneous, impulse-driven purchases that used to happen when people were already walking through a mall simply stopped happening once people stopped going to malls in the first place. Picture the mechanics of it from the ground up. A mall-based RadioShack didn't rely on customers waking up and deciding, specifically, that today was the day they were going to buy a phone charger or a set of batteries. It relied on foot traffic that was already there for other reasons. Someone doing their weekend shopping, killing time before a movie, walking past the storefront on their way to a department store anchor tenant. That kind of incidental exposure is what drives impulse purchases, and it's incredibly powerful when it works. But it's also completely dependent on other people bringing the crowd. RadioShack wasn't generating its own foot traffic in a mall location, it was borrowing it. And when the department stores anchoring those malls started closing, when overall mall visits began declining year over year as shoppers shifted to big box stores and online orders, RadioShack's mall locations lost the very thing that made them profitable in the first place. They were still paying premium mall lease rates, but the crowd that used to walk past the door simply wasn't there anymore. Just as RadioShack was trying to absorb the damage from big box retail and mall decline, a new and far more dangerous competitor was entering the arena: Amazon. In the early 2000s, Amazon made a deliberate decision to go after the electronics accessories market, the exact category that had quietly become one of RadioShack's most profitable segments. Because here's the thing about a store like RadioShack: the real money often wasn't in selling the big-ticket electronics themselves. It was in selling something like an HDMI cable that cost $2 to source from overseas manufacturing, priced up to $20 or $30 at retail. High margin, low cost, constant demand. Amazon wanted that business, and they went after it aggressively, bringing in their own inventory, along with an enormous ecosystem of third-party sellers on their marketplace, to flood the category with cheap options. Suddenly you had a situation where RadioShack might be selling a $30 HDMI cable, and the exact same cable was available on Amazon for $3. Customers noticed immediately, and there was no reasonable way for a physical retail chain with real estate overhead to compete with that kind of pricing gap. By the early 2010s, the core business model that RadioShack had been built on for half a century had essentially eroded to nothing. The parts business, gone. The accessories business, gone. The specialized electronics business, gone. Customers simply weren't coming into the stores anymore because better, cheaper, more convenient options existed everywhere else. There's a broader shift buried in that Amazon story that's easy to gloss over. The internet didn't just give customers a new place to shop, it gave them near-perfect price transparency for the first time in retail history. Before smartphones and instant price comparison, a customer walking into a RadioShack for an HDMI cable had no real-time way of knowing that the exact same cable sold for a tenth of the price somewhere else. The retailer held the informational advantage. Once that informational advantage disappeared, once anyone with a phone in their pocket could check prices in seconds, margin-heavy accessory categories like the ones RadioShack depended on became almost impossible to defend. It wasn't just that Amazon was cheaper, it's that customers finally had the tools to notice. It's worth zooming out here, because by the mid-2000s, RadioShack wasn't dealing with one competitor or one shift in consumer behavior. It was dealing with 4 separate, compounding pressures, all landing at roughly the same time. There was the big box pressure from Walmart and Target, undercutting on price through scale and loss leader promotions. There was the superstore pressure from Best Buy, which could simply outstock and outdisplay RadioShack in every category that mattered. There was the e-commerce pressure from Amazon, which stripped away RadioShack's pricing power on the small, high-margin accessories that had quietly become one of its most important categories. And there was the structural pressure of mall decline, which hit a huge portion of RadioShack's real estate at the exact same time everything else was going wrong. Any one of those 4 pressures, on its own, might have been survivable with the right strategic response. A company can usually absorb one major disruption if it has the balance sheet, the leadership, and the time to adapt. What made RadioShack's situation so brutal is that all 4 pressures arrived in roughly the same 15-year window, compounding on top of each other faster than any single leadership team could realistically respond. By the time executives fully addressed one front, 2 more had already opened up. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because there was one thing that kept RadioShack alive through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, even as everything else was collapsing around it. And that same thing would eventually finish the job: cell phones. In the early 1990s and into the 2000s, wireless carriers were locked in an intense battle for market share, and the economics of the cell phone industry at that time worked heavily in RadioShack's favor. Once a customer signed up for a cell phone plan, they tended to stay with that carrier for years, sometimes well over a decade. Because of that customer stickiness, carriers were willing to pay substantial bounties to any retailer who could sign up new customers on their behalf. RadioShack, with its enormous footprint of nearly 8,000 convenient locations, was perfectly positioned to become exactly that, a distribution network for new phone contracts. In effect, RadioShack quietly transformed into a chain of cell phone sales outlets. In the 1990s, cell phone revenue made up just under 20% of RadioShack's total sales. By the early 2000s, that number had climbed to roughly 45%. Nearly half of everything the company sold was tied to phones and phone plans. But there was a deep irony buried in this lifeline, because the cell phone itself was rapidly absorbing every other category RadioShack used to sell. Think about what a cell phone actually became over that decade. It replaced the specialized PDA. It replaced the standalone answering machine. It replaced the portable radio. And eventually, it started replacing cameras, calculators, GPS devices, and more. Year after year, model after model, the phone in your pocket kept swallowing more of the dedicated gadgets that used to require a separate trip to a RadioShack. The very product line that was propping the company up financially was simultaneously wiping out the rest of its inventory. It's worth pausing on just how unusual this dynamic is. Most companies that get disrupted watch a competitor eat their market from the outside. A cheaper rival, a new platform, a different distribution channel. RadioShack's situation was stranger than that, because the product doing the damage was, for a while, also the product keeping the lights on. Every single cell phone RadioShack sold was, in a very real sense, a tiny act of self-cannibalization. Each new customer walking out the door with a phone in their pocket was a customer who now had a built-in radio, a built-in calculator, an alarm clock, a camera, a voice recorder, and eventually a flashlight, a GPS unit, and a web browser, all bundled into a single device they'd never need to visit a RadioShack to replace individually again. The commissions from that sale were real money in the short term. But structurally, the company was financing its own decline, one sign-up at a time, and almost nobody inside the business fully reckoned with that trade-off while the checks were still coming in. Even the cell phone business, RadioShack's last real growth engine, had an expiration date, and it arrived in two distinct waves. The first wave was market saturation. RadioShack's cell phone windfall existed because carriers were desperate for new sign-ups and were willing to pay generously for them, sometimes as much as several $100 to $1,000 per new customer. But that model depended on there being a steady stream of brand new customers to sign up. Eventually, the market simply filled up. Most people who wanted a cell phone already had one, and the pool of genuinely new subscribers began shrinking. Carriers weren't paying nearly as well for renewals or plan changes. The real money was only in fresh sign-ups, and there just weren't that many fresh sign-ups left to chase. The second wave was more deliberate, and arguably more damaging. Wireless carriers grew tired of paying huge commissions to third-party retailers like RadioShack for something they could increasingly do themselves. So they started building out their own branded retail footprint at scale. By the late 2000s, AT&T alone operated close to 3,000 of its own branded stores, and that number doesn't even include Sprint, T-Mobile, or the other major carriers doing the exact same thing. Once the carriers had their own extensive retail networks, they started deliberately steering their best, highest-value customers into those in-house stores, keeping the most lucrative accounts entirely for themselves. What was left over for RadioShack were the scraps, customers on prepaid or pay-per-minute plans, people who weren't especially profitable to sign up in the first place. The commission checks that had propped up nearly half of RadioShack's revenue started drying up fast. By 2011, the damage caught up with the company. That year marked the last time RadioShack turned a profit. From that point forward, the stores were consistently unprofitable, and the company never found its way back to sustained profitability again. The slow bleed that had been building for over a decade finally became unavoidable. In 2015, RadioShack filed for bankruptcy for the first time. The company didn't disappear outright. It was picked up and kept alive by a private equity fund, in the kind of rescue deal that's common when a well-known brand still carries some residual value, even if the underlying business doesn't work anymore. That rescue didn't hold. Just 2 years later, in 2017, RadioShack filed for bankruptcy again. From there, the company effectively limped along as a shell of its former self, getting passed between a series of different owners, none of whom found a way to meaningfully revive it. In 2020, the brand landed with an investor group led by internet personality Tai Lopez. The pitch behind this acquisition was to reinvent RadioShack as an e-commerce operation and generate renewed hype and buzz around the name. That vision largely failed to materialize into anything resembling the company's former scale. What the new ownership group did manage to do, however, was use the RadioShack name at the peak of the crypto boom to launch a cryptocurrency token under the RadioShack brand. But no amount of hype could change the underlying reality. The world had already moved on, and RadioShack had missed the windows it needed to evolve into something that could survive long term. A crypto token wasn't a business model. It was a final, almost surreal footnote on a company that once stood as a genuine retail powerhouse. There's something almost poetic, in a dark way, about how that final chapter played out. A brand that spent its entire existence built around tangible, physical electronics, wires you could hold, parts you could solder, batteries you could feel the weight of in your hand, ended its public life attached to a purely speculative digital asset with no underlying product at all. It's about as far as you can get, conceptually, from where the company started in a small Boston storefront selling radio parts to hobbyists. The name had value. The brand recognition had value. Millions of people still had some kind of nostalgic association with those red and white storefronts. But brand equity and nostalgia aren't the same thing as a functioning business, and no amount of borrowed hype from the crypto markets was ever going to change that underlying math. Here's a strange detail that most people don't know. Even now, there are still places in the United States where you can technically buy something under the RadioShack name. Scattered across small towns, particularly in more rural parts of the country, there are independent, family-owned stores, often general stores or furniture shops, that operate as informal RadioShack dealers or license holders. They stock a small selection of RadioShack branded products, and if someone in a small town needs something like an HDMI cable, a replacement phone charger, or a TV antenna, they can walk into what looks, from the outside, like an ordinary local shop, and find a small aisle that still carries a piece of the old RadioShack identity. It's not the same experience as the RadioShack of the 1980s or 90s, but it's a quiet reminder that the brand, in some scattered form, never fully vanished. It just shrank down to a fraction of what it once was. These surviving pockets exist almost entirely in places that the big retail wave never fully reached. Small towns far enough from a Best Buy or a major Walmart that driving in for a single cable or connector simply isn't worth the trip. In that narrow, specific context, the old RadioShack value proposition still technically holds. Convenience for a customer who doesn't have many other nearby options. It's a strange full-circle moment when you think about it. RadioShack's original 1960s strategy was to be the convenient, nearby option for people who needed a specific part and didn't want to travel far to get it. 60 years later, in a tiny fraction of its former footprint, that's essentially still the exact role these last few licensed outlets are playing, just at a scale that's a rounding error compared to the 8,000-store empire the brand once commanded. So, could RadioShack have avoided all of this? Looking back at the 1990s and 2000s, there were real paths the company could have taken. It could have leaned into the growing repair and service industry the way companies like iFixit eventually did. It could have gone all in on the superstore model the way Best Buy did, matching scale with scale instead of trying to compete with a fraction of the square footage. There were pivots available. The problem wasn't necessarily that the opportunities didn't exist. It's that by the time the company needed people with the vision to spot them, the generation that had built RadioShack's original identity had already moved on, and there wasn't the leadership left in place to recognize what was coming and make the difficult changes required to adapt. And that's really the core lesson buried inside this entire story. When disruption comes for a business, whether that disruption is technological, regulatory, or simply a shift in what customers want, you typically get a window, sometimes more than one, to recognize it and pivot. If you don't take that window, your fate tends to get sealed. RadioShack actually saw its disruption coming, more than once. It just didn't act on it in time. And in the end, the company that once anchored strip malls across the entire country ended up attached to a crypto token during a speculative bubble, a strange, almost fitting bookend to a business that spent its final years chasing hype instead of building anything that could last. What makes RadioShack such a useful case study isn't that the company made one catastrophic mistake. It's that it made almost no single catastrophic mistake at all. Every individual decision, viewed in isolation, made a certain amount of sense at the time. Slimming down to 2,500 core items under Charles Tandy was smart. Riding the DIY repair culture of the mid-20th century was smart. Getting early into home computers with the TRS-80 was smart. Leaning hard into cell phone commissions when carriers were throwing money at any retailer who could sign up new customers was, for a while, extremely smart. The failure wasn't any one of those choices. It was the absence of a moment, at any point along the way, where leadership stepped back and asked what the business would look like once each of those advantages inevitably expired. Repairable electronics gave way to disposable ones. Strip mall convenience gave way to two-day shipping. Commission-based phone sales gave way to carriers cutting out the middleman entirely. Each wave was survivable on its own. It was the accumulation of waves, arriving faster than the company could reposition itself, that ultimately became unsurvivable. There's also something worth noting about timing and leadership continuity. The people who originally built RadioShack's identity, Charles Tandy and the generation of managers around him, understood the business at a level that newer executives, brought in decades later to manage an already strained company, simply couldn't replicate. Founders and early operators tend to carry an instinct for the why behind a business, not just the what. When that generation aged out and moved on, RadioShack didn't just lose institutional knowledge. It lost the kind of pattern recognition that might have caught the early warning signs of disposable electronics, e-commerce, and carrier consolidation before they fully matured into existential threats. By the time those threats were undeniable, the company was already playing defense with a leadership bench that hadn't been the one to build the original advantages in the first place. That's the story of RadioShack, a company that mastered its moment so completely that 94% of an entire country lived within 5 minutes of it, and then watched nearly every one of the forces that built that dominance turn around and dismantle it, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a name.